So I had heard about HP Lovecraft for years. More specifically, Cthulhu is his most famous character. So finally, maybe 10 years ago, I decided to read Call of Cthulhu. Good book to start with. A few years after that, going through an airport, had nothing to do, so I decided to get a book, looking through the bookstore in the airport, and there was a collection of HP Lovecraft stories, so I figured, okay, I'll read some more of these. That was my mistake. So Lovecraft, first thing when you're going to start reading Lovecraft for the first time is to remember that he wrote his stories for magazines. So Weird Tales and Strange Tales and magazines like that. So he was writing maybe once a month, one story a month, two at the most. Sometimes he might be writing even less frequently than that. And his writings are a little more tolerable at that rate than trying to read 5 or 6 stories one right after the other. And I say this, he's a good writer. I like, his writing style is good. It gets repetitive at times. So when you read 5 or 6 stories one after another, he starts using the same words over and over again, and you sort of start to wonder, is this guy some sort of hack or something? You got to remember, he didn't write his stories to be read one right after the other. He wrote them to be read a month or two between stories. So first piece of advice for new readers of Lovecraft is don't read them one right after another. Read a story, take a break, read the next one a week later or so. Because, like I said, his writing style is good, but he does tend to repeat the same phrases and words here. He's got his favorite words he likes to use, like miasma and stuff like that. And it can get, it can actually get tedious after a while as you read the stories, and it's just almost like you can't tell where one story ends and the next one begins, just because he's repeating himself throughout them. So I've read most of what's been published by Lovecraft, or most of his works which have been published. There are a few which I hear just got lost, so no one knows what there are. I've read most of them only once, and so is there an order they should be read in? And my answer to that is maybe. On the one hand, you would think that reading them in the order he wrote them, even though they aren't really all related, but they all, he likes to follow the same themes, and they are somewhat connected, just because he uses the same characters, and it's his main thing is Earth has been inhabited by what he refers to as elder gods. Are basically aliens from either different galaxies or different dimensions or different times or whatever, and so they've left their influence on Earth. Whether, like I said, most of these have been here long before man evolved, but some of them left their psychic fingerprint here. Some of them still return and visit from time to time. There's one species which can project its thoughts through time, so even though they've been dead for millions of years, they can still affect us just because millions of years ago they decided to contact us in today. And so someone might get this message from them or be possessed by them, as the case may be. And so he wrote these stories, and they're all about things, most of them, because these creatures, gods, whatever you want to call them, are from outside of our experience. He's writing about things that basically man cannot understand, and that it's sort of his purpose to do that. It's not to, our standard story today is aliens visit us and they leave their technology and we analyze their technology and do whatever with it. This is aliens contact us and they don't tell us a thing about their technology or what they're doing or their motives or anything. It's up to us to figure it out. At the end of his stories, there's a little bit of frustration because there are so many unanswered questions in some cases. Not all cases, but some cases. And so that's one thing. If you start reading Lovecraft, you should take into consideration that it's not going to be tied up into a nice package at the end of the story. It may leave you a little confused in the end. And so when it comes to reading them, is there an order you should read his stories in? Not really, because there will be some things which it's helpful to read this story before that story. But other than that, there's a certain amount of randomness. There are some things he never explains. One creature, Shub-Niggurath, or Shub-Niggurath, the goat of 1,000 young. He never explains what that is. He mentions it in almost, half of the Arkham cycle, or he called it the Arkham cycle. Most of his readers call it the Cthulhu mythos, but I go by his name, the Arkham cycle. This, just people just, randomly call out to Shub-Niggurath. We assume, because he refers to it as a goat, that it might have had horns or hooves or been some other devil type look to it. That it's called the goat of 1,000 young sort of implies that at one point in time people worshipped it as a fertility god or goddess. Other than that, we know absolutely nothing about it. It's just something people mention from time to time, and they never go into detail on it. And we get no description of it or anything like that. And that's the way he wrote, because he's dealing with subject matter that man doesn't understand. His purpose is not to enlighten us on these weird creatures. His purpose is to say there are things out in the universe that we don't understand, we will never understand, and deal with it. So I actually got a little off topic there. So I was talking about these ancient creatures, and they left their imprint on society in some way. And so basically most of humanity has forgotten about them, but either through, like I said, they're contacting us, or they're leaving a psychic imprint, or ancestral memories coming from the days before we were human, or way back, before humans evolved. People somehow picked up on them. And ancient, it's not right to say ancient, it's like even pre-civilization. So Neanderthal man to just primitive societies got these records of these creatures somehow. Most of these records have been destroyed. They were passed on by word of mouth and never survived. But sort of prehistoric religions were based on some of these creatures, because we had these ancestral memories, psychic fragments, whatever you want to call them, that let us know something about them. Our biggest source is the Necronomicon, It was written in the early 700s by the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazard, um, fictional character who, and none of the stories does H.P. Lovecraft go into a lot of detail on this guy, but he did write a history of him. So, we do know from some of his notes on stories and this history of this guy and history of the Necronomicon a little bit about him. He apparently worshipped some of these strange creatures from the past, and as a result he went mad, but apparently he learned enough about them to write a book about it, which was called the Necronomicon. Some people call it just the Book of the Dead. Lovecraft had another, it came from three Greek words, nekros meaning dead, nomos meaning knowledge, or and then ikonos meaning basically symbols or icons. And people who have studied Lovecraft say that his attempt at translating Necronomicon into something useful as a word wasn't really that good, and Necronomicon really doesn't mean what he says it means. So a lot of people just say it's the Book of the Dead. And so the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazard wrote this book presumably. It was found to be, it was banned on and off throughout time. Several copies were lost because, it was burned and destroyed and it was considered evil. So to this day, only 5 known copies exist. And so the heroes of Lovecraft stories, if you want to call them heroes, basically their knowledge comes from the Necronomicon. And even that's very fragmented. It doesn't give us a lot of information. So if you're going to start reading Lovecraft, go into it with the understanding that you're not going to get all the answers at the end. That's a sort of second rule to reading Lovecraft. Third piece of advice I would say is follow the ambitagonist. And that's a word I'm making up. So basically your protagonist is the hero of the story, and he's got the Dunwich Horror. One of his stories has people who are protagonists. Your antagonist is the bad guy in the story, and the Thing on the Doorstep is a Lovecraft story which has definite antagonists in it. And then you have this made-up word which I call ambitagonist, which is basically they're neither heroes nor villains. They are sort of ambivalent or ambiguous, which is why I call them ambitagonists. And they're people, they're just sort of dragged along with the plot by forces out of their control. And so the color from outer space, or the color of outer space, I think it's called. The characters in that are ambitagonists. And it's not that they're completely ambiguous. There are, you read them and they're quote unquote good people we would call good. However, their morality has nothing to do with the story or the plot. Their actions are outside of their control because they're being pulled along by strange forces which they can't control. So they're basically ambiguous. The Shadow over Innsmouth, the main character there, he looks like a protagonist to begin with, but as you read it, he becomes an ambitagonist. He has really not a lot, things get out of his control very quickly. In fact, looking at him as an ambitagonist helps to resolve the story in the end. It looks like he actually turns into an antagonist at the end, but you got to remember, no, this is actually stuff going on which he has no control over. And again, I say look for the ambitagonist just because it'll help you you're dealing with things you don't understand. The characters don't understand some of these things either. Just realizing that things are going on outside the character's control makes the stories easier to understand and easier to follow, easier to enjoy too. Because if you get too caught up in trying to make sense out of Lovecraft, which you can do if you read the stories enough times, but if you're trying to, your first time through, if you're going to try to make sense of it all, it's going to get, again, frustrating because he's purposely writing about things which man's not supposed to understand. And so as a first-time reader of Lovecraft, trying to understand Lovecraft is almost counterproductive. So like I said, the Arkham cycle, yeah, he has basically two major groups of writings. One's the Arkham cycle, or the Cthulhu mythos, as some people say. This takes place around, basically most of these stories take place in rural New England. Arkham is a fictional town he created, which is sort of not a large town, it's sort of, I guess, medium-sized town. Miskatonic University is there. A lot of people say Miskatonic University, for some reason they think it's haunted and all because Lovecraft wrote about it. It's really the important thing about Miskatonic University is it has one of the few copies of the Necronomicon. And so that's really all. There's nothing in any of his writing says it's particularly a haunted university or anything like that. It's just that it conveniently has the Necronomicon, or a copy of it, in its rare book vault. So the protagonists, when they exist, have a source of information if they need it. But even then, a lot of the stories take place in small towns outside of Arkham, or just other places in New England. His other set, I think it's called the Dreamwork cycle or the Dreamtime cycle. I can't remember exactly. That sort of goes into like almost another universe that you can visit in your dreams, and it's got a bunch of stories. It's less, I think, it's less popular than the Arkham cycle, just because, again, Arkham cycle is where Cthulhu exists, and so he seems to be the major figure in Lovecraft that people, even though Cthulhu doesn't really appear in many stories, or actually he only appears in one story, he's only mentioned in 2 or 3 stories, he's still very popular. And I would say, Call of Cthulhu is a good story to start with because it's got, even though you don't fully understand what's going on, it is easier to understand. I think a lot of people like Cthulhu because he's well described. Basically, he's humanoid with a squid head and with lizard wings or reptilian wings. A lot of Lovecraft's other creatures you have to think about as you read it and try to picture in your mind what they are like. And being humanoid makes Cthulhu a lot easier to picture in your mind. So you get this quick picture of what Cthulhu looks like, and you can get on with the story, rather than trying to picture this weird creature in your mind. So that's just some basic information for anyone who's heard about Lovecraft and wanting to read it or read any of his stories. Like I said, Call of Cthulhu is a good one to start with. Be prepared to be a little confused, and that's all. I hope you enjoy this video, and if you do read any Lovecraft, I hope you enjoy it. Thank you. Goodbye.